The hot sun burned over the Arizona desert as two young Apache sisters walked side by side, their worn sandals pressing into the dust. Naya, the older of the two, carried a small bundle of herbs and blankets tied together with rope. Her younger sister, Ahioka, clutched a clay jar filled with water, though it was already nearly empty. They had been walking for hours and their throats ached with thirst, but they did not complain. Both knew that complaining would not fill their stomachs or soften the stares of the strangers waiting for them in the town ahead. The sisters had left their people behind weeks earlier. Their tribe had been driven from fertile land, pushed into rocky valleys where little grew. Hunger followed them like a shadow and sickness spread through the camp. When their mother passed away, Naya promised her younger sister that they would find a new life somewhere safer, somewhere where they could work with their hands and earn food honestly. They had heard stories about towns where settlers, ranchers, and miners lived together, where there was always work for people willing to cook, clean, or heal the sick. The sisters clung to these stories with hope. At last, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the sisters saw the faint outline of a settlement in the distance. Wooden fences, smoke rising from chimneys, and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer reached their ears. This was not a large city, but it was bigger than any village they had seen. The closer they came, the more nervous Ahioka grew. She tugged at Naya's sleeve and whispered, "Do you think they will let us stay?" Naya swallowed her own doubt before answering. "We will work. We will cook. We will serve. They cannot send us away if we show them our hearts." When the sisters reached the town's edge, the chatter of children and the stomping of horses filled the air. The main street stretched before them, lined with shops, a saloon with swinging doors, and an inn whose windows glowed with lantern light. Townsfolk stopped what they were doing to stare at the newcomers. Their gazes were sharp, some filled with curiosity, others with cold suspicion. Naya and Ahioka felt the weight of every eye. The sheriff was the first to step forward. He was a tall man with gray hair and a thick badge pinned to his vest. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver, though he did not draw it. He studied the sisters with a stern look and asked, "What brings you here?" Naya bowed her head slightly, showing respect. Her voice trembled, but she spoke with all the strength she could gather. "We have no home. Our people suffer. We wish only to work. We can cook, we can clean, we can serve. Just let us in." Her words carried across the silent street. For a long moment no one spoke. Then murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Apaches," one man whispered, tugging his child closer. "They'll bring trouble," another muttered. But an old woman peered closely at the sisters and said softly, "They're just girls. Look at them. They're hungry." Ayoka's heart pounded as she clutched Naya's arm. She wanted to speak, but fear pressed her lips closed. She remembered her mother's words that silence can sometimes speak louder than cries. So she stood firm beside her sister, her eyes lowered, her body still. The sheriff sighed heavily. "This town has seen enough trouble," he said. "Outlaws, droughts, raids, we don't need more strangers stirring fear." Naya felt her throat tighten. If they were sent away now, there would be nowhere else to go. She dropped to her knees in the dust, her voice rising with desperation. "We'll work, we'll cook, we'll serve. Please, just one chance," gasps echoed through the crowd. The plea touched something in the hearts of a few listeners. The innkeeper, a round man with flour on his apron, stepped forward. He scratched his beard thoughtfully and looked at the sisters. "I could use extra hands in the kitchen. My wife's been ill, and we've more travelers than we can manage. If they're willing to scrub floors and stir pots, maybe they can stay for a while." The sheriff frowned but gave a small nod. "One night. If they cause trouble, they're out." Relief washed over the sisters. They bowed their heads deeply, whispering thanks in their own language. The crowd slowly dispersed, though not without more whispers. Some looked on with pity, others with disapproval. But for Naya and Ahioka, it was enough. That night they entered the inn for the first time. The air inside was thick with the smell of roasted meat and tobacco smoke. Ranch hands crowded around tables, their laughter loud and careless. A few turned to stare at the sisters, their faces filled with curiosity, suspicion, or both. The innkeeper's wife, pale and tired, pointed toward the kitchen. "Start there," she said in a weary voice. The sisters wasted no time. Naya rolled up her sleeves and began chopping onions, while Ahioka scrubbed pots until her arms ached. Though the work was hard and the wages promised were small, the sisters did not complain. Every movement was filled with determination. They knew that every dish they cooked and every plate they cleaned was a chance to prove themselves. As the hours passed, Naya prepared a stew using herbs she had carried from her homeland. The smell drifted out into the main room, catching the attention of weary travelers. "What's cooking?" one man asked, sniffing the air. Soon, bowls of the stew were served, and the ranch hands nodded approvingly. "Best thing I've tasted in weeks," one said with a grin. Though tired, the sisters smiled quietly at each other. For the first time in many months, they felt a small flicker of hope. When the lanterns were finally dimmed and the last customer left, the innkeeper locked the door and looked at the sisters. His expression was cautious but not unkind. "You worked hard tonight. You can sleep in the storeroom. Tomorrow we'll see if you can keep up." The sisters bowed again, whispering thanks. In the small storeroom, surrounded by sacks of flour and barrels of beans, they laid down their thin blankets. Exhaustion pulled at their bodies, but their hearts were lighter than they had been in years. As they drifted to sleep, Naya whispered to Ayoka, "We are still here." "That is enough." Ayoka smiled faintly in the darkness. "One chance," she murmured. "That's all we need." The moonlight slipped through the cracks of the wooden wall, bathing their faces in silver glow. Outside, the town slept peacefully, unaware that two young sisters had just begun the hardest journey of their lives, one that would test their strength, their patience, and their faith in kindness. They had entered the town with nothing but hope and a desperate plea. For now that plea had been heard. But the days ahead would show whether the town was ready to accept them, and whether their promise, "We'll work, we'll cook, we'll serve," would be enough to earn them a place in this wild frontier. The next morning, the sisters woke up in the storeroom of the inn. The air smelled of flour and beans, and the wooden floor was rough beneath their thin blankets. Naya rose first, stretching her tired arms. Ayoka rubbed her eyes and looked around, almost surprised they were still in the town and had not been chased away in the night. For a moment, the two sisters simply sat in silence, grateful that they had a roof over their heads, even if it was only the storeroom of an inn. Before the sun was fully up, the innkeeper's wife appeared at the door. She looked weary and pale, but her sharp eyes scanned the sisters carefully. "Up, you two. The kitchen won't run itself." Naya nodded quickly. "We are ready." The sisters threw off their blankets and hurried to the kitchen. Already the sounds of the town were rising outside. The clatter of horses' hooves, the calls of shopkeepers opening their doors, the hammering of the blacksmith. Inside the inn, ranch hands were gathering ready for breakfast before heading out to the fields. The air was filled with noise and expectation. Naya stirred a pot of porridge while Ayoka fetched water from the pump. The sisters worked swiftly, trying to stay out of the way of the innkeeper, who moved about with brisk steps. When the first bowls were carried out, ranchers dug in hungrily. Some barely looked at the sisters, but others stared with curiosity, whispering to each other. "Those are the Apache girls," one man muttered. "Should we trust them?" another asked. But a third man, spoon halfway to his mouth, grinned and said, "Well, if they keep cooking like this, I won't complain." The words warmed Naya's heart. She smiled faintly to herself, though she kept her head bowed. Ayoka, more shy, avoided looking anyone in the eye, but she heard the whispers and felt the weight of the townsfolk's judgment. Not everyone was kind. Later that day, when the sisters carried laundry to the stream, a group of young boys followed them. They threw pebbles and laughed, calling out cruel names. Ayoka's eyes filled with tears, but Naya took her hand and whispered, "Do not answer. We are stronger than their words." They continued walking, heads held high, though inside their hearts ached. That evening, the sisters sat by the fire in the kitchen, resting their sore hands. Ayoka whispered, "Why do they hate us even when we are working so hard?" Naya thought for a moment, her eyes on the flames. "They do not know us. Fear makes people cruel, but fear can change. We will show them who we are, not with words, but with kindness." The days passed slowly, filled with work. The sisters washed dishes until their fingers wrinkled, scrubbed floors until their knees ached, and cooked meals that filled the bellies of strangers. They slept each night in the storeroom, too tired to dream. Yet every morning they woke with determination, repeating the promise they had made when they entered the town. "We'll work. We'll cook, we'll serve." One afternoon, Ayoka noticed a small child coughing in the corner of the inn. His mother looked worried as she rocked him gently. Ayoka recognized the sound of sickness, the same rattling cough she had seen in her tribe. Quietly, she approached the woman. "I know herbs that can help," she said softly. The woman hesitated, unsure whether to trust her, but as her child's cough worsened, she finally nodded. Ahyoka slipped outside and gathered a few herbs from her pouch. She boiled them carefully, whispering a prayer her mother had taught her. When the child drank the warm mixture, his breathing eased, and by morning his cough had softened. The mother's eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing Ahyoka's hands. Word of the small healing spread quickly. Some townsfolk began to see the sisters in a different light, not as strangers but as girls with skills that could help. Still, prejudice lingered. The sisters often overheard whispers behind their backs. One evening, as Naya served stew, a traveling merchant accused her of stealing a silver spoon. "I saw her slip it into her bundle," he claimed loudly. The room grew tense, all eyes turning to the young woman. Naya's face flushed with shame. She shook her head. "I did no such thing." The sheriff was called, and the sisters feared the worst. But before the sheriff could speak, the young schoolteacher, Miss Clara, stepped forward. She had been quietly observing from her table. "That is not true," she declared firmly. "I saw this man put the spoon into the girl's bundle himself. He is lying." Gasps filled the room. The merchant sputtered in protest, but his words carried no weight against the teacher's honest reputation. The sheriff glared at the merchant and ordered him out of town. The sisters stood frozen, relief and gratitude washing over them. Miss Clara placed a gentle hand on Naya's shoulder. "Do not lose heart," she said kindly. "This town can be unfair, but not everyone wishes you harm." That night in the storeroom, Ahyoka whispered, "She believed us." "Someone believed us." Naya nodded, her eyes glistening in the dim lantern light. "One by one hearts can change, but we must be patient." From that day, Miss Clara often visited the inn, bringing books or simply sharing kind words. The sisters grew to trust her, and through her a few more townsfolk softened toward them. Children who once threw pebbles now sat at their feet, listening to stories of the stars and the ancient tales their mother had told them, but not everyone was ready to accept them. A wealthy rancher named Mr. Hollis spoke loudly in the saloon one evening, saying, "Mark my words, letting those Apache girls stay will bring ruin to this town. They don't belong here." His voice carried far, and many nodded in agreement. The sisters heard of his words but said nothing. They knew anger would only fuel more hatred. Instead, they kept working, cooking, cleaning, healing, and quietly proving that they wanted only peace. Each day was a test of strength. Each whisper of doubt was a weight on their shoulders. But the sisters refused to break. They clung to their promise and to the hope that one day, the people of the town would see them not as outsiders, but as human beings deserving of dignity and kindness. As the weeks went on, the sisters' presence slowly began to feel less foreign. Some still muttered behind their backs, but others smiled at them openly. The children laughed when Ahyoka showed them how to weave simple patterns with grass. The miners looked forward to Naya's stews at the end of a long day. And in the quiet hours after the inn closed, the sisters allowed themselves to dream, not of being sent away, but of truly belonging. For now, they had not yet won the hearts of all. But they had taken the first steps. They had shown strength in the face of cruelty, kindness in the face of doubt, and though the road ahead would be long, Naya and Ahyoka held on to hope. Because hope, like fire in the desert night, was the only thing that kept them alive. The days turned into weeks, and soon the sisters were no longer strangers at the edge of town, but steady workers at the inn. Each morning before the sun climbed over the hills, Naya was already at the stove preparing breakfast, while Ahyoka carried buckets of water from the pump. They worked without complaint, their hands quick, their movements sure. The innkeeper, though not a man of many words, began to nod with quiet approval when he watched them. The townsfolk were still divided in their feelings toward the sisters. Some clung to suspicion, whispering that the Apache women did not belong among them, but others were beginning to notice the value they brought. Naya's cooking had become famous not just among the travelers who stayed at the inn, but among the ranch hands who stopped by after long days of work. Her venison stew, spiced with herbs she carried from her homeland, became a favorite. People began to ask for it by name, saying no other meal could fill their stomachs quite the same way. Ahyoka found her own place too. Though younger and quieter than her sister, she had a gift for healing. Her knowledge of plants and herbs often surprised the townsfolk. When children fell ill with fevers, mothers came to her in secret, desperate for help. She never turned anyone away. Using her small bundle of dried herbs and roots, she prepared teas and poultices that eased coughs, lowered fevers, and soothed pains. At first, some doubted her, saying it was Indian magic, but when they saw their children recover, their doubts softened into respect. One evening, a miner stumbled into the inn, his face pale, his hands trembling. His little boy had been sick for days, and no medicine from the general store had helped. Desperate, he begged Ahyoka to try. She hurried with him to his home, where she found the boy weak and burning with fever. Kneeling beside the child, she whispered prayers as she prepared a mixture of willow bark tea and cool cloths for his forehead. She stayed through the night, tending carefully, and by morning the boy's fever broke. The miner was overcome with gratitude. He carried the news back to town, telling everyone how the young Apache girl had saved his son. That story spread faster than wildfire, and suddenly Ahyoka was no longer just a quiet helper in the kitchen. She was the girl who could heal. Even the sheriff, who had once doubted them, came quietly to the inn one evening. He sat at a table, his arm bandaged clumsily from a scrape during a scuffle. Naya served him stew, and when Ahyoka offered to rewrap his wound with cleaner cloth and herbs, he allowed it. He did not speak much, but when he left, his nod to them was slower, more thoughtful than before. But not everyone was convinced. Mr. Hollis, the wealthy rancher, grew more vocal in his dislike. He shook his head when he saw the sisters on the street, muttering that the town was making a mistake by letting them stay. "Mark my words," he said to anyone who would listen at the saloon, "you'll regret trusting them. People like that bring nothing but trouble." His voice was bitter, and though not everyone agreed, some still nodded along. The sisters knew of his words but did not answer them. They chose instead to let their actions speak. Whenever they heard unkind whispers, they bowed their heads and continued their work. When someone mocked their broken English, they smiled faintly and said nothing. Their patience became their shield, their kindness their quiet answer. Children, however, did not carry the same prejudice as their parents. They were curious about the sisters, often gathering around when Ahyoka sat by the inn's porch in the evenings. She would weave simple patterns with grass or tell soft stories about the stars. "That one is the hunter," she explained, pointing at the sky. "That one is the coyote. Long ago, the coyote placed the stars in the sky to guide us." The children listened wide-eyed, their laughter echoing in the night air. It was the children who first began to treat the sisters as friends rather than strangers. They carried stories home, and slowly their parents began to see the girls differently. It was not easy, and acceptance did not come all at once, but the small changes gave Naya and Ahyoka hope. The work at the inn grew heavier as summer stretched on. Travelers passed through daily, ranch hands crowded the tables, and the sheriff sometimes stopped by for a meal. Still, the sisters carried every burden without complaint. At night, when their bodies ached from exhaustion, they would whisper to each other in the storeroom. "Do you think they are starting to see us differently?" Ahyoka asked one evening. Naya smiled faintly. "Yes, but we must keep going. We must never forget our promise. Work, cook, serve. That is how we will earn our place." One afternoon, the sky darkened with heavy clouds. A storm rolled in, bringing strong winds and dust. Crops in the surrounding farms suffered, and soon food became scarce. The townsfolk worried as the drought stretched into weeks. Hungry children cried, and men returned from the fields with empty baskets. The sisters knew this hardship well. They had seen their own people suffer during times of drought. Naya searched her bundle of herbs, mixing roots with dried cornmeal to stretch the meals. She created stews out of almost nothing, filling the bellies of ranchers and travelers alike. Ahyoka taught mothers to brew teas from leaves that eased thirst when water was scarce. Their efforts did not go unnoticed. People who once doubted them now nodded in greeting. Farmers thanked them for keeping their families fed. Mothers spoke kindly of Ahyoka's healing hands. Even the innkeeper, once hesitant to take them in, began to treat them with respect. Still, Mr. Hollis remained unmoved. He warned the town again and again, saying, "These girls are only pretending. You'll see their true colors one day." His words spread unease, but fewer people listened now. The sisters' actions spoke louder than his bitterness. One night, as the sisters lay in their blankets, Ahyoka whispered, "Do you think we will ever truly belong?" Naya gazed at the ceiling in the dim lantern light. "We belong as long as we do good." Belonging is not given, it is earned. And we will earn it, even if it takes our whole lives. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters. Inside, the sisters held on to hope. Their journey was far from over, but they had taken another step toward the life they dreamed of. For the first time since they arrived at the town, they dared to imagine a future, not one of wandering and hunger, but one where they had a place, where their hands and hearts could build something lasting. They had not yet won everyone's trust, but they had earned enough to keep their promise alive. And so, day by day, through quiet patience and unshaken kindness, the sisters continued to weave their story into the fabric of the town. They had arrived as beggars pleading for a chance. Now they were becoming something more. They were becoming needed. The days of summer dragged on, and though the drought left its mark on the farms and ranches, the town continued to stand. The sisters had begun to find small acceptance among many of the townsfolk. They worked harder than anyone else, kept their promise to cook, clean, and serve, and offered kindness even when it was not returned. It seemed as though their long struggle might finally bring them peace. But peace in the Wild West was never steady. Trouble always rode on horseback, and one fateful evening it came thundering into town. It was a hot night, the air thick with dust. The sisters were in the inn's kitchen, preparing stew for the last of the travelers. Laughter drifted from the dining hall as men played cards and women chatted softly. Suddenly, the sound of horses galloping hard broke through the calm. The ground trembled as hooves struck the dirt road outside. Shouts followed, then a crash as doors slammed open. Naya froze, ladle in hand. Ahyoka looked up, fear flashing in her eyes. Through the small window, they saw a group of rough men riding into town. Their faces were hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats and bandanas, their guns glinting in the lantern light. There were at least a dozen of them, and they came with the look of wolves circling prey. Within minutes, the once lively street fell into chaos. The men fired shots into the air, shouting for gold, food, and drink. People screamed and scattered, running into alleys or bolting their doors. The sheriff hurried out to confront them, but the outlaws were swift. One struck him down with the butt of a rifle, leaving him bleeding in the dirt. Panic spread like fire. The ranchers and miners who had been laughing moments ago now scrambled for cover. Women clutched their children and fled. The outlaws stormed into shops, overturning shelves and demanding money. In the kitchen, Naya gripped Ahyoka's hand. "Stay calm," she whispered. "We cannot run. We must help." The inn shook as the gang burst inside, demanding whiskey and food. The innkeeper trembled as he tried to serve them. Naya and Ahyoka stayed hidden for a moment, their hearts racing. Then they heard the cries of a woman outside. Peeking through the doorway, they saw her kneeling beside the injured sheriff, blood soaking through his sleeve. Without hesitation, Ahyoka ran forward, carrying strips of cloth. She knelt beside the sheriff and pressed the cloth against his wound, whispering for him to stay awake. He groaned, his face pale, but she worked steadily, tying the cloth with quick hands. The outlaws laughed when they saw her. "Look at that," one sneered. "The little Apache girl playing nurse." But Ahyoka did not lift her head. She kept working, her focus unbroken, her heart pounding. Inside the inn, Naya saw the fear in people's eyes. Families huddled in corners, children cried, and no one seemed able to act. She remembered her father's teachings, that courage was not found in the absence of fear, but in choosing to act despite it. She stepped forward, her voice steady, though her body shook. "Everyone come with me. We must move the women and children to safety. Do not stay here." At first no one moved, but when she gently took a frightened boy by the hand and led him toward the storeroom, the mothers followed. Soon she had guided a small group through the back door, leading them to a safer place in the cellar of the blacksmith's shop. The outlaws, too busy shouting and drinking, did not notice at first. But soon one of them saw the movement. "Hey," he barked. "Where do you think you're going?" Naya's heart nearly stopped. For a moment it seemed as though he would fire his gun, but the townsfolk who had been emboldened by her bravery stepped forward. A ranch hand, usually quiet, grabbed a chair and raised it high. Another man picked up a broom handle. The outlaws laughed at the makeshift weapons, but their laughter only made the townsfolk more determined. A fight broke out, loud and desperate. Glass shattered, tables overturned, fists flew. The outlaws were strong, but the townsfolk fought with the courage of people defending their homes. In the middle of it all, Ahyoka pulled the sheriff to safety, continuing to bind his wound. Hold on, she urged. You must not give up. The town needs you. Naya stood near the doorway, shouting for people to stay together. She moved quickly, helping a woman escape through the back, then returning to guide another child. Fear threatened to paralyze her, but each time she looked into the eyes of the frightened people, she found strength. The battle stretched late into the night. The townsfolk, inspired by the sisters' bravery, fought harder than they ever had. The outlaws, shocked by the resistance, began to falter. A few fled into the darkness, their horses kicking up dust as they disappeared into the plains. The rest, realizing they could not control the town, retreated angrily, swearing they would return. When the last of the gang was gone, the town was left in silence. Smoke curled from broken lanterns, and the streets were littered with debris. The townsfolk, bruised and shaken, gathered together. Slowly, they looked toward the sisters. Ayoka knelt beside the sheriff, whose eyes fluttered open. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. She saved me. He pointed at Ayoka, his voice carrying enough for others to hear. And Naya, covered in dust and sweat, stood tall among the townsfolk, who had seen her courage with their own eyes. They remembered how she had led their children to safety, how she had spoken with calm strength when all others froze. The people of the town were silent for a moment, then a murmur of gratitude spread. They helped us. They saved us. We could not have done this without them. The sisters stood side by side, their hearts still racing, their hands trembling from the night's events. They had not planned to be heroes, but when the moment came, they had chosen to act. And in doing so, they had shown the town not only their worth, but their courage. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and gold, the sisters looked at each other. Exhausted, yes. Afraid still. But for the first time they saw in the eyes of the townsfolk not suspicion, not fear, but something new. Respect. The night of fire and chaos had changed everything. They had arrived in the town with nothing but a plea. We'll work, we'll cook, we'll serve. Now they had given more than work or food. They had given their courage, their strength, and their hearts. And though the battle had left scars, it had also planted the seed of something the sisters had long dreamed of: belonging. The morning after the long night of fear came slowly. The first rays of sunlight touched the rooftops, and the town stirred awake with heavy hearts and tired bodies. Smoke still drifted from broken lanterns, glass crunched beneath boots, and the street looked like the scars of a battlefield. But though the town bore marks of the outlaw raid, it had not been destroyed. It had survived. Naya and Ayoka stepped out from the inn, their clothes dusty, their eyes shadowed with exhaustion. They had not slept at all. Their arms still ached from carrying frightened children, and Ayoka's hands were red and raw from bandaging wounds through the night. Yet even in their weariness, their faces carried quiet strength. They had faced the fire, and they had not run. The townsfolk gathered slowly in the street, their voices low at first. Men leaned on broken fences, women held their children close, and ranch hands wiped soot from their faces. All of them turned to the sisters. For the first time since their arrival, the town did not look at them with suspicion, but with recognition. The sheriff, pale but alive, stood at the center with his arm in a sling. Ayoka had spent hours tending to him, and though his voice was weak, he called for silence. The townsfolk fell quiet, every eye fixed on him. These two girls, the sheriff said, his voice firm despite the pain in his chest, came here begging only for a chance, and last night when the rest of us faltered, they gave more than we asked for. They saved me. They saved our children. They saved this town. He removed his hat slowly, holding it to his chest. For a long moment the street was silent. Then the innkeeper clapped his hands together, the sound sharp in the quiet morning. He's right, the innkeeper said. We owe them more than a meal in a storeroom. We owe them our respect. The crowd stirred, voices rising one by one. They stood with us. They didn't run. They're part of this town now. Mothers stepped forward, tears shining in their eyes, thanking Ayoka for saving their children. Ranch hands bowed their heads in respect to Naya, remembering how she had guided their families to safety. Even the children, their eyes wide with admiration, ran to the sisters, wrapping their arms around their waists. Naya and Ayoka looked at each other, their hearts heavy with emotion. For so long they had been strangers, outsiders, whispered about in shadows. Now they were being embraced in the open daylight. The sheriff raised his hand once more. From this day forward, no one here will call them strangers. They are part of us. They have earned their place. A cheer rose, hesitant at first, then growing stronger until the whole street echoed with it. The sisters stood at the center, tears slipping down their cheeks, not of sorrow but of relief and joy. The innkeeper and his wife approached them. "The storeroom isn't a home," the innkeeper's wife said softly. "From now on, you'll have proper beds. You'll eat with us, not in the shadows of the kitchen. You belong here." The sisters bowed their heads, whispering their thanks. Their voices trembled, but their gratitude was clear. The days that followed were filled with rebuilding. Broken fences were mended, windows replaced, and the sheriff's wounds healed under Ayoka's careful hands. Naya spent long hours in the kitchen, cooking meals not just for paying guests but for townsfolk who worked together to repair what had been damaged. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was cooperation. Miss Clara, the schoolteacher, invited the sisters to her classroom. "The children want to hear more of your stories," she said warmly. And so, in the afternoons, Ayoka sat with the children, teaching them the old tales of the stars and the desert animals. Their laughter filled the small room, and their parents, peeking in from the doorway, could not help but smile. The sisters' lives had changed, but they did not forget the journey that brought them here. They remembered the nights of hunger, the cruel whispers, and the heavy weight of doubt. Those memories became fuel for their kindness. Whenever someone new arrived in town, tired and frightened, the sisters were the first to greet them, offering food, comfort, and the promise of welcome. Even Mr. Hollis, the rancher who had spoken against them, found his voice silenced. After the attack, his barns had been damaged, and when no one else stepped forward, Naya and Ayoka helped him repair them. They worked side by side with his ranch hands, never once reminding him of his harsh words. Shamed by their generosity, Hollis bowed his head the next time he passed them on the street. He did not speak against them again. As autumn came, the town grew stronger, more united than before. The sisters were no longer just helpers in the kitchen or healers in the shadows. They were part of every story, every gathering, every prayer for the future. At church, they sat beside the townsfolk, no longer at the back. At the harvest feast, Naya's stew was the centerpiece, and Ayoka was praised for saving lives during the drought and the attack. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert sky in red and gold, the sheriff visited the sisters at the inn. He stood tall now. His strength returned, though the scar on his arm was still fresh. "You both gave this town more than we deserved," he said. "You asked only for a chance, and in return you gave us your courage. I won't forget that. None of us will." Naya lowered her eyes humbly. "We only did what was right," Ayoka added softly. "This town gave us a place when we had none. We are grateful." The sheriff smiled faintly, tipping his hat. "No, we are the grateful ones." As night fell, lanterns lit up along the main street. Music and laughter drifted from the saloon, and families gathered on porches. The sisters stood together outside the inn, watching the town they had once entered with bowed heads and trembling voices. They remembered the words they had spoken at the gates, the desperate plea that had carried them this far. "We'll work. We'll cook, we'll serve, just let us in, now." Those words no longer carried desperation. They carried pride. They had kept their promise, and the town had answered with acceptance. Ayoka leaned her head against her sister's shoulder. "Do you think Mother would be proud?" she whispered. Naya's eyes glistened in the lantern light. "Yes," she said softly. "She would see that we have made a home, that we are safe." The desert wind carried the sounds of laughter and music, mingling with the quiet hum of the night. For the first time since they had left their tribe, the sisters did not feel like wanderers. They were part of something larger than themselves. They were no longer outsiders. They were daughters of the town. As the stars began to appear in the sky, Ayoka pointed upward, as she had done so many times with the children. "Look," she whispered, "the coyote is watching." Naya smiled. "He placed the stars to guide us, and he has guided us here." Together the sisters stood hand in hand, their hearts full. They had walked into the town as beggars, pleading for a place to stay. Now they stood as women who had earned their home, their respect, and their future. The Wild West was harsh, filled with dust, hunger, and danger, but it was also a land of second chances. And for Naya and Ayoka, that second chance had become their greatest gift.